Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Wesley Marr. I'm a city guy. Apartment heat, fluorescent grocery aisles, and doors that actually lock. Weekends were the exception. Weekends were rock, ice, and thin air, the kind of exhaustion that clears your head. The first alerts looked like any other bad night downtown, just shaky clips on a feed. One showed people sprinting across an intersection while a man stumbled after them, arms wide, jerking like he couldn't feel his own joints. Another showed a hospital entrance, security fighting to hold back a crowd, and someone in scrubs yelling, back up, over and over until the audio cut. Phones still worked, but the service got thin. Local radio kept repeating isolated incidents, and the host tried to sound calm, but you could hear the crack in his voice. On my street, porch lights blinked on and off like people were testing if the power grid was still real. My neighbor leaned over his railing, face pale in the dark, and asked, "You hearing anything real?" I shook my head and said, "Nothing real, just rumors." By midnight, the sirens never stopped. The city didn't feel dangerous in one big way. It felt dangerous in 100 small ways, like every doorway had turned into a trap. The next morning, an emergency text hit every phone. Shelter in place, avoid contact with anyone acting confused or aggressive. That last line stuck. It didn't sound like a riot or a storm, it sounded like infection. A plan formed fast. High ground, fewer people, colder air. There was a winter shelter I'd seen on a map but never used. Getting there would be a nightmare, and staying there would be worse. By late afternoon, gridlock was setting in, and I was packing like I might never come back. The mountains sat on the horizon, silent and cold. They looked like the only place left that wasn't screaming yet. I just hoped I could reach the tree line before the city followed me. The truck was an old Silverado, rusted at the wheel wells but mechanically stubborn. It already held the things that lived in the bed year-round: a shovel, a tow strap, a headlamp, and a battered duffel stuffed with extra gloves and a spare base layer. Everything else came from a violent, fast sweep through my apartment. I wasn't hunting for perfect gear. I was grabbing the things that still function when the grid goes down and the rules stop mattering. Food was priority one. I swept the pantry into bags: cans, rice, pasta, peanut butter, trail mix, jerky, anything dense enough to justify the weight and shelf-stable enough to survive without a fridge. Water came next. 2 jugs from the closet plus every Nalgene bottle I used for hiking. A camp pot, a metal mug, and a tiny alcohol burner slid into the same bag because hot water fixes more problems than people admit. Warmth gear filled the gaps: wool socks, a puffy down jacket, a rain shell, and a knit cap got shoved into the top where my hands could find them fast. Defense was the last box I opened. A bolt-action hunting rifle I'd inherited from my uncle sat in a case under the bed. It wasn't a fantasy tool or a tactical toy, it was just something simple that cycled rounds in freezing weather. 2 boxes of ammo went in with it, and the rules stayed simple: unloaded in the truck, chamber empty until it had to be otherwise. A folding knife and a small hatchet came too, mostly because wood, rope, and frozen knots don't care about your intentions. The building hallway smelled like stale cigarette smoke and spilled beer, even though nobody on my floor smoked. A woman from the second floor stood there with a suitcase and a phone pressed hard to her ear, eyes wet, voice low. She glanced at my heavy pack and asked, "You leaving?" And I shifted the weight on my shoulder and said, "Yeah," then paused for a second and added, "Lock up and don't open this door for anyone." She nodded slowly, like she already knew that was the only advice left. Street level was worse. Cars were double parked with doors hanging open and nobody inside. A city bus sat sideways across 2 lanes, hazard lights blinking in a dying rhythm, while a line of people walked past carrying grocery bags like they were evacuating a flood zone. At the next light, a man slapped his palms on my hood and yelled for help, face twisted in panic. But before I could even crack the window, he spun and ran. Windows stayed up. Doors stayed locked. The city had turned into a place where hesitation gets you boxed in. The main highway was already gridlocked. so the route shifted to side streets and frontage roads behind warehouses. The kind of industrial strips that don't show up on postcards. Sirens wailed from every direction, blending into a single ugly noise. In the rearview mirror, smoke rose in thin black columns. It wasn't one big fire, it was scattered points of trouble. Near a gas station, 4 people argued at a pump, and one held a metal pipe like a scepter. Nobody was getting back in line. Nobody was thinking past the next 60 seconds. Fuel was the first problem that could turn into a fight, so I didn't test my luck in town. The plan was to reach the last small outpost before the mountains and fill up there, where fewer people meant fewer bad decisions. Every intersection had its own little crisis. A stalled car, a shouted argument, someone sprinting with a backpack and a wild look in their eyes. By the time foothills replaced billboards, the noise finally dropped. Trees thickened, cell service flickered, then died completely. That quiet should have been comforting, but it felt wrong, like the world had stepped away from the table in the middle of a high-stakes game. At a pull-off, a state trooper blocked half the road with his cruiser, waving traffic through with jerky motions. A woman in the car ahead leaned out her window and shouted, "Where are the closures?" The trooper didn't look at her, he just waved his hand and yelled, "Keep moving!" His voice sounded shredded, tired, and definitely not in control. The last town sat at the mouth of the canyon. One grocery store, one diner, one gas station with a bright sign that still hummed. People were there, but they weren't milling around. They moved with purpose, heads down, hands full. I filled the tank, topped off a red jerry can, and paid cash inside. The clerk looked at my gear and said, "You headed up?" "Yeah," I answered. He nodded once, grimly, and said, "Good luck." He said it like it was a weather forecast for a storm that wasn't going to end. From there, the road climbed hard. Sunlight thinned behind the ridgeline. Patches of snow showed up in the shade, and the temperature dropped fast enough to fog the windshield at stops. 2 cars sat on the shoulder with hoods up, steam drifting from radiators with nobody working on them. People don't abandon working vehicles unless they have a reason, and lately the reasons were getting uglier by the hour. The Trailhead lot came into view just before dark. It was half full, which meant other people had the same idea, but it wasn't chaos. No shouting, no crowd, just scattered vehicles and a cold wind pushing through the pines. A laminated map board stood near the entrance, and the line that mattered was marked with a small square icon. Winter Emergency Shelter, tucked below the tree line in a shallow bowl on the north side. I'd seen it on a route guide and told myself it was just a backup plan. Now it was the only plan. No shortcuts, no second guesses. Packing shifted from stuff in the truck to stuff I can move. Straps tightened, weight kept close, water and food centered. But the volume was too much for one back. I went to the truck bed and pulled out a rigid plastic utility sled, something I usually used for hauling firewood. It wasn't tactical, just a bright orange tub, but it meant I could drag twice what I could carry. I lashed the overflow gear and the extra water to it with bungee cords. The rifle stayed in a soft case with a shoulder strap, so both hands stayed free. The first steps on the trail were familiar, even in fading light. Dirt gave way to old snow. Footprints showed someone had gone up earlier, and the pattern looked steady, not panicked. Wind came down the drainage with a faint smell of wood smoke. Dinner or trouble, it meant one thing. The mountains weren't empty. The trail climbed through thick pine for the first mile, a steady, lung-burning slog. The plastic sled dragged behind me, catching on roots and hissing over patches of ice, the bungee cords groaning with every uneven step. Then the trees broke, opening into a shallow bowl where the wind had scoured the snow down to a hard, slick crust. A faint smell of wood smoke drifted through the air once, sharp and distinct, then faded just as fast. That told me someone had a fire somewhere, or they had one recently. Either way, it meant I wasn't the only warmth on this mountain. A small weathered signpost leaned at the split. One arrow pointed toward the main ridge route, the other toward the winter shelter. The shelter line was the quieter one, narrower, less traveled, and it dropped slightly before curving around a massive rock shoulder. That drop mattered. It put the destination in a natural defilade, a dip where the wind would slide over the top instead of slamming straight into the door. The first time the shelter came into view, I almost walked past it. It wasn't a cabin. It was a low metal half-cylinder, basically a miniature Quonset hut painted a dull, matte gray that blended perfectly into the rock and dirty snow. Drifts had piled high against the uphill side, effectively burying half the structure, while the downhill side sat exposed in a pocket of scrub oak and saplings. No lights, no smoke, no footprints leading to the threshold, which was either good news or a trap. The door was a heavy slab with a simple industrial handle and a latch that looked like it belonged on a mechanic's tool chest. A small vent sat high on one end, and two tiny factory windows were clouded with thick frost. No porch, no steps, just a short stamped metal threshold and a strip of ancient ice where boots had packed the snow down over the years. Before touching anything, I stopped and scanned the perimeter. Wind hissed in the branches. Snow grains skittered across the rock like dry rice. That kind of quiet can hide a lot. And the last thing I wanted was to be bent over a lock while something came charging out of the trees. A quick loop around the shelter showed the basics. The backside was half buried, which would help with insulation but meant the roofline could load up dangerously in a heavy storm. The vent looked clear, not blocked by debris. No fresh claw marks, no blood, no signs of forced entry. The place didn't look contested, it looked abandoned, which was exactly what I needed. I unhooked the sled, stepped up to the door, and tried the handle. The latch clicked open, the sound cracking through the cold air like a gunshot. Inside, the smell hit me instantly. Raw metal and old dampness like a garage that's been sealed shut since last winter. The space was Spartan. Two narrow metal benches running along the sides, a small shelf, a couple of heavy-duty hooks, and a bare floor that was cold enough to numb my toes through my boots. A thin layer of frost clung to the seams where the wall panels met, and old water stains ran down the curved walls like rust tears. The shelter kept the snow off your head, but it didn't hold a degree of heat. A few things had been left behind by previous travelers. A cracked plastic scoop, some old candle stubs in an Altoids tin, and a busted foam pad chewed up by mice. Under one bench, an orange emergency box held 2 foil blankets, a tiny first aid packet, and a laminated card instructing users to keep the door shut and the vent clear. My first move was a mental shift. Treat this like a base of operations, not a temporary hideout. That meant turning it into something quieter, warmer, and harder to see into. The metal walls were thermal bridges. They would steal body heat aggressively. And those little windows would flash any internal light like a beacon to the valley below. If the wrong people or the wrong things made it up this trail, this shelter needed to look dead. I hauled the bags off the sled and tossed them onto the benches, keeping them off the freezing floor where moisture would soak them. The sled itself I flipped over and tucked into the scrub brush outside, covering it with snow. Inside, I switched my headlamp to red mode. The rifle stayed by the door, still unloaded but propped within arm's reach. I tested the door with a hard shoulder push. It held, but the metal flexed more than I liked, and the latch rattled. A dedicated shove from the outside could pop it, and it definitely wasn't built to stop someone desperate. 2 problems showed up fast: cold and moisture. The metal skin made the interior feel colder than the air outside, and my breath was already leaving a wet film on the wall near my face. If I ran a flame in here without a plan, the condensation would turn this place into a dripping icebox by morning. Wet gear kills you just as fast as freezing temps. A plan formed in steps, the way it always does when you can't afford to screw up. Step 1, insulation and draft control. Step 2, controlled heat. Step 3, water management. Step 4, light discipline. Step 5, an escape route if the bowl stopped being quiet. Most of that required scavenging, not from the shelter, but from the Trailhead caches and that small maintenance shed I'd passed near the parking lot. Those places always had leftover materials: tarp, foam, tape, maybe tools. It wasn't stealing in my head, not anymore. It was commandeering for survival. A quick inventory check set the timeline. The food I'd hauled up on the sled, cans, dry bags, the dense stuff, could last maybe 2 weeks if I rationed strictly. But winter doesn't care about rationing, it cares about calories. Water was fine for the moment, and melted snow would become the routine. What I lacked was bulk insulation to break the thermal bridge on these walls and a safer heat source than my tiny alcohol burner. Night was coming fast, and moving back down the trail in the dark was suicide. The shelter would be home for tonight, and the hard labor would start at first light. I ate a handful of trail mix, drank 2 measured mouthfuls of water, and forced myself to slow my heart rate. Rushing is how you drop gloves, lose tools, and make noise. Outside, the wind shifted and carried that wood smoke smell again, closer this time, before it vanished like someone had just smothered a fire. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it wasn't. Either way, I closed the shelter door, set the latch, and asked myself the simple question: how much could I change this tin can before winter and the rest of the world found me? And if someone was out there, they already knew where I was. Morning arrived pale and biting, and the inside of the shelter actually looked worse in the daylight. Frost lined every seam, and a thin sheen of moisture had dried into ugly streaks where my breath had hit the metal overnight. That's the fatal flaw of a bare capsule. It blocks wind and snow, but the metal acts as a massive thermal bridge, pulling heat out of your body and radiating it into the void. The fix wasn't complicated, but it was going to be labor. I needed insulation, a tighter seal on the door, and total control over light leakage. The materials weren't up here, so the first trip had to go back down the trail while the sky was clear and my legs still had some snap in them. The Trailhead lot had changed overnight. 2 more cars had arrived, and one sedan had a door hanging wide open, dome light dead like someone had bailed out in a blind panic. The lot was empty of people. A gust of wind slapped the laminated map board, making it rattle against its frame, and the sound cracked through the air louder than it should have. Behind the lot, a low-maintenance shed sat near the snowplow turnaround. The padlock was cheap brass, and the screws on the hasp were already half-stripped from years of weather. A flat bar popped the wood and the door swung in. Inside, the place smelled like diesel and wet rope. It was full of the mundane gear that suddenly becomes priceless. Blue tarps, rolls of duct tape, boxes of heavy-duty zip ties, a coil of paracord, and a stack of foam pads that looked like kneeling mats for mechanics. I also found a roll of thick construction plastic, visqueen. That was the jackpot. Plastic doesn't add warmth by itself, but it traps air. And dead airspace is the only thing that stops a body from bleeding heat into a steel wall. I grabbed the plastic, 2 foam pads, a half roll of aluminum foil tape, and a bundle of bungee cords. A rusted hand toolbox yielded tin snips, a stubby screwdriver, and a small file. All of it went into my pack. It was bulky, but the weight was manageable. Back at the shelter, the first job was the floor. A frozen floor creates a heat sink that will kill you in your sleep. 1 foam pad went down flat, and the second got sliced into strips to fit along the curved edges where the metal met the ground. Next came the walls. The plastic sheeting went up first, not tight to the metal, but spaced off it using bungees and tape to create that crucial air gap. For a minute, it looked sloppy, like a kid's jerry-rigged fort, but once I anchored it along the bench edges and hooks, it stopped flapping and started acting like a second skin. Over that, I taped up the foil blankets in sections, not for magic warmth, but to reflect radiant heat back toward the center instead of letting it soak into the cold steel. The windows were the biggest tactical risk. Even a tiny pane of glass can throw light like a signal mirror at night, giving anyone outside a clear view of movement inside. I didn't want to black out the windows completely because maintaining a watch on the bowl was critical, but I couldn't have a bright rectangle advertising my position. I covered most of each window with foil, leaving only a narrow strip uncovered at the bottom, just enough to scan the trail while sitting low on the floor. These narrow strips became my observation slits. I didn't cut into the shelter body, I cut into the layered insulation I'd just built. The slits were about 2 fingers wide and a hand long, one facing down trail, one facing the tree line. A flap of dark cloth was taped over each slit on the inside, acting like a drop curtain I could lift with a single finger. The door needed more than tape. I cut a strip of foam to act as a gasket for the latch area, then used aluminum tape over the seam to kill the draft. A bungee cord ran from the interior door handle to a bench leg, keeping constant tension on the latch, while a second cord went lower as a backup. The goal wasn't to make it impossible to open, it was to make it slow, noisy, and difficult to breach with a single shove. Noise discipline was the final step. Metal makes everything sound sharp and percussive, so I padded the contact points. A strip of foam went under the latch stop, cloth went under the pot and burner. Tape went on the floor where gear would land. It felt obsessive, but in a quiet bowl, a dropped spoon sounds like a cymbal crash. By late afternoon, the shelter looked less like a bare tube and more like a small fortified room. It still wasn't warm, but the drafts had dropped from a steady leak to a faint background hiss. I sat on the bench, watched my breath, and saw significantly less fog sticking to the walls. Less moisture meant less ice. Outside, the light slid away behind the ridge. The wind picked up again, but the shelter didn't ring and vibrate the way it had the night before. For the first time since bugging out of the city, it felt like I was tilting the scales instead of just reacting to the fall. The next problem was sustainable heat that could run for weeks, not hours, and that meant going back down for the heavy stuff. Not tonight, but soon. If the valley stayed loud and the mountain stayed quiet, this capsule would have to survive both. The shelter held the wind better now, but internally it still felt like a refrigerated toolbox. Heat was the next layer. In a metal tube this small, heat isn't just about comfort, it's about survival, and it has to be strictly controlled. The little alcohol burner I'd brought was fine for boiling a cup of water, but it wasn't a heater. It put out a weak flame, produced a ton of condensation, and the fumes forced you to keep the door cracked if you wanted breathable air. That works for 10 minutes. It doesn't work for a mountain winter night. Down at the Trailhead shed beyond the main room, I'd found a storage locker filled with bulkier gear, stuff road crews use when they're stuck out in a blizzard. A boxed tent stove sat on a shelf, dusty but intact, complete with a nesting stovepipe stack and a flat spark screen. It was heavy-gauge steel, not the ultralight titanium hikers brag about, but a heavy bomb-proof box designed to burn all night. Carrying that on my back along with the pipes would have been a recipe for a spinal injury. That's where the sled earned its keep. I loaded the stove, the pipe sections, and a few extra fuel canisters onto the orange plastic tub and dragged it up the trail. It was a brutal, slow slog, the plastic hissing over ice and grinding on rock, but it got the hardware to the bowl in one trip. I also grabbed a single burner canister stove and a nesting pot set. The canister stove wasn't for heating the room. It was for tactical cooking when I couldn't afford the smoke or the glow of a wood fire giving me away. Inside the shelter, placement was a game of inches. Fire wants space, and this capsule didn't have any to spare. The stove went near the door, positioned where the intake vent was closest and where the radiant heat wouldn't melt my new plastic wall liner. I rigged a square of scrap sheet metal as a heat shield behind it and placed a thicker piece underneath as a hearth pad. The stovepipe ran up toward the existing factory vent. I didn't punch new holes through the shell. I just adapted what was there, sealing the gaps with high-temp aluminum tape and jamming fiberglass insulation into the cracks. The first burn was a test run. I used a handful of pencil-thin sticks, standing deadwood I'd snapped off nearby pines. The draft caught, the flame roared, and the shelter warmed up fast. That felt amazing for exactly 30 seconds before the physics kicked in. Moisture climbed immediately. Warm air hit cold metal and the walls started to sweat. If I didn't manage it, it would rain inside. So the rule became absolute. If the stove runs, the fresh air vent stays cracked and the door stays unsealed enough to cycle air. It was a constant balancing act between freezing and rotting from dampness. And nobody, absolutely nobody, sleeps while the fire is roaring. Collecting wood became a daily job. Being below the tree line meant fuel was available, but harvesting it required discipline. I couldn't be out there hacking with a hatchet and ringing the dinner bell for every zombie or looter in the valley. I stuck to deadfall, branches already on the ground or stuck in the lower canopy, dry enough to snap by hand. Bigger pieces came later, but only when the bowl was dead quiet. I built a small stash outside on the downhill side, tucked in the defilade behind a rock so it wouldn't collect snow. Wet wood doesn't burn, it smolders. Smoldering creates thick white smoke and a heavy smell, and both of those travel miles in this thin air. Cooking got split into 2 lanes. For actual meals, the canister stove ran low and quick, just enough to rehydrate a meal or warm a can of beans. For warmth and drying gear, the wood stove ran in short, hot burns, usually morning and evening. The heavy steel body of the stove stayed warm long after the fire died, providing a passive radiator effect that was safer than keeping a flame going while I slept. Water was the other constant grind. The city teaches you to trust faucets. The mountain teaches you to trust routines. Snow went into the pot, lid on, stove low. The conversion ratio is heartbreaking. A pot full of fluffy snow melts down to an inch of water. It became a cycle: melt, pour, repeat. I used tape to mark my bottles, one color for treated drinking water, another for gray water or unprocessed melt. This kept me from cross-contaminating a clean supply with a dirty pot rim. A second water rule was non-negotiable. Never melt snow directly in a plastic bottle. It warps the plastic, creates leaks, and leaves you short on containers. Light discipline was strict. Inside, my headlamp lived on the red setting. White light was authorized only when the door was fully sealed and the window slit covers were dropped. Cold drains batteries fast, so my spares lived in an inner pocket of my puffy jacket, close to body heat. I set up a small solar charger on a rock near the shelter, lashed down with paracord so the wind wouldn't steal it. It didn't pull much power in the winter sun, but even a partial charge meant the radio and the lamp stayed alive. Information was scarce. Phone service was a memory. The emergency broadcast radio caught a weak signal at night, mostly automated loops and static. Occasionally a human voice broke through, tired and clipped, talking about road closures and public safety zones like those words still held authority. I listened for 10 minutes a night, enough to know the world hadn't snapped back to normal, but not enough to drain the battery. Hygiene had to be planned because getting sick in winter kills you as fast as a bullet. The corner nearest the door became the clean zone. Wet wipes, sanitizer, a toothbrush, and a trash bag lived there. Boots came off at the same spot every time. Socks got checked for dampness, and feet got dried before getting into the sleeping bag. That wasn't about comfort, it was about preventing trench foot. Outside, I picked a latrine spot downwind and downhill, far enough that the smell wouldn't drift back. I used a small shovel and a roll of dog waste bags. I walked the same path to get there every time to minimize the spread of footprints. If someone tracked me, I wanted them following a trail to a hole in the ground, not to my door. By the end of the first week, the shelter had systems: heat on wood, stealth cooking on gas, water on a schedule, light kept red, trash contained. It wasn't cozy, it was a life support machine, but it was workable. The next step was securing enough calories to keep the machine running. Tomorrow I'd have to go lower for food, and I'd have to come back before the sun and the temperature dropped. The first stretch up here wasn't dramatic, it was a grind. And the grind is what keeps you alive when the weather turns and the world below starts breaking apart. Mornings started with the same SOP. Check the door bungees for tension, clear the vent, keep the blackout flaps down until I was sitting low and ready to scan. A quick sector scan down the trail, a second scan across the tree line, and then the stove routine began. A handful of dry sticks went in, the flame caught, and the shelter warmed just enough to make my fingers functional again. Moisture was the constant enemy. Even with the plastic liner, breath and wet gear tried to turn the walls into a slick sheet of ice. The fix was boring labor: wipe the seams, hang socks near the residual heat, and keep the vent cracked even when the incoming air felt like a slap in the face. Too much heat without airflow meant fog, then drips, then a frozen tomb. Fuel runs became quiet missions. Dead branches got snapped by hand instead of chopped, because the thwack of a hatchet is a sound that travels for miles in thin air. I dragged longer pieces instead of carrying them to avoid brushing against the shelter and scraping metal, a noise that sounds unnatural in the woods. The wood stash grew behind the rock, and I covered it with a tarp weighted by stones to keep it from turning into a frozen lump. Food stayed simple. A hot mug in the morning, small caloric bites through the day, then one real meal at night. The canister stove handled most of it. Quick flame, lid on, no smoke, no fuss. A warm stomach is the only way to sleep. The valley noise never fully reached this bowl, but it left hints. Some nights, a low siren sound drifted up the canyon like a dying animal. One night, a steady glow sat on the horizon for hours, and the sky above it pulsed a faint, sickly orange. Tracks showed up on the trail a few days in. One set was clean boot prints going up, then the same prints going back down. Steady, straight, someone hiking with a purpose. Another set came later, messy, uneven, with long scuffs that looked like a person dragging their toes. Those prints did not leave. They stopped near the creek crossing below the bowl, then wandered off into the timber. The first close encounter happened at dusk when the wind dropped. I was outside stacking wood, keeping movement small, when something moved near the lower switchback. At first it looked like a deer, but then the shape stood upright and swayed. It was a man's jacket, dark pants, no pack, no poles, and no reason to be this high at this hour. He didn't walk like a tired hiker. He walked like his legs were numb instructions he barely understood. He stopped, turned his head too slowly, and then kept coming, drawn by the faint crackle from my last stove burn and the smell of smoke on my gloves. But he was slow. The sprinting aggression I'd seen in the city was gone. Up here, the deep freeze stiffened their joints and slowed their motors. I slid back into the shelter and pulled the slit cover up a fraction of an inch. The man hit the trail junction and paused like he was listening to the trees. His face looked pale even in the low light, and his mouth was stained dark. He took one more step, stumbled, and caught himself on a branch without flinching. No shots, no shouting. The goal wasn't to win a fight. The goal was to stay invisible. I dropped the slit cover. The stove stayed cold. I sat on the bench with the rifle across my knees, breathing through my nose, waiting for the sound of boots on the threshold. Minutes passed. Then came a soft scrape on rock and the faintest tap against the metal shell. Someone's hand brushing the outer wall while they searched for an entry. The bungees held. The latch didn't rattle because of the foam pad I'd added. The shelter stayed silent. A low grunt came next, wet and exhausted, followed by another scrape. Then footsteps drifted away toward the trees. The tapping stopped. The bowl went still. After that, the protocols tightened. No fire after late afternoon. No cooking smells near the door. Wood brought in before sunset. Slits checked in short bursts, never long stares. If something came up the trail, it would meet a dark tube that looked abandoned. 2 days later, fresh marks appeared at the base of a nearby pine, clawed lines in the bark and a smear of something dark on the snow. Something had been close while I slept. The next morning, the radio caught a broken message between static bursts, a voice warning people to avoid shelters and camps because infection follows supplies. That was obvious now. Anyone with food became a beacon, and anyone with a beacon became a target. The stock in my pack was shrinking. The wood pile was healthy, but food is what moves your feet, and winter burns more calories than you expect. The camp-down trail had a kitchen, a storage room, and probably fuel canisters. That meant risk, but it also meant buying time. The decision settled in while the wind pushed snow through the branches. The raid on the camp couldn't wait for perfect conditions because perfect conditions don't exist in winter. The only question left was how to get in, get what I needed, and get back without bringing anything with me that could follow. The camp sat a few miles downrange, far enough that it had its own weather patterns and its own acoustic signature. Getting there meant leaving the bowl, leaving the stove, and abandoning the one place that felt partially controlled. The only advantage I had was daylight, so the move started early with a cold breakfast and a tactile check of every strap and buckle. My gear loadout was light. 1 day pack, the rifle on a 2-point sling, a small pry bar, and a couple of heavy-duty trash bags for scavenging. I brought the canister stove too, just in case I got pinned down and needed to boil water without smoke. Before stepping off, I secured the capsule to look abandoned. Door bungees tight, slit covers dropped, wood stash camouflaged, and nothing left inside that would roll or clink if the wind rocked the shell. The descent was slow and deliberate. The snow on the trail was packed hard in places and powdery in others, forcing me to fox walk, landing each step flat to roll the weight and avoid that loud, distinct crunch that travels like a gunshot in cold air. The tracks from the scuffing walker I'd seen earlier were older now, half filled with fresh drift, but they still guided the eye. Something had been moving up and down this route, and it definitely wasn't a recreational hiker. The camp appeared through the trees as a cluster of dark, depressing shapes. A main lodge, a smaller maintenance shed, and a line of picnic tables buried in drifts. A windbreak fence leaned at a drunk angle, and a torn blue tarp snapped softly against a post. No smoke rose from the chimney. No lights showed in the windows. That didn't mean it was empty, it just meant whoever was there understood the value of not advertising. I took a long pause before the final approach, listening to the wind, the branches, and the faint creak of the hut settling in the freeze. The place smelled like wet ash and stale pine, with that heavy dead edge you get around buildings that haven't breathed in a long time. From the tree line, the front door looked intact, but the snow at the threshold was churned into a muddy brown slush. My first move was a wide perimeter circle. The shed door was ajar by an inch. One window on the main hut had a crack in the corner taped from the inside with something dark. Footprints crossed the yard in several different patterns, and some of them dragged heavy heels. A smear of brown stained the snow near the woodpile, and the sight of it made my stomach tighten. The mission objective remained simple: food and hardware, not a firefight. The rifle stayed at the low ready, safety on. I hit the shed first because it had fewer blind angles. A boot nudged the door and it swung open with a dry squeal that sounded agonizingly loud. I froze, waiting for a reaction, but the wind covered it. Inside, the shed smelled like white gas and damp canvas. A rack held spare tools, a bow saw, a splitting maul, and a bundle of hatchets. On a shelf sat a box of stovepipe sections and a coil of fiberglass gasket rope, gold dust for my heating system. Another shelf held cans of liquid fuel, and beside them were 2 sealed isobutane canisters. Those went straight into my pack. A milk crate on the floor offered the random hardware that holds the world together: a box of screws, hose clamps, and a roll of heavy baling wire. I didn't find tin snips, but I grabbed a pair of metal shears. The shears, wire, clamps, and screws went into an outer pocket. If the capsule was going to last until spring, it needed structural reinforcement, not just duct tape. The hut was the risk. The back door faced the dense trees and was half hidden by a snowdrift which offered cover but also meant I was walking into a potential fatal funnel. A narrow path led to it, packed by boots and dusted with fresh powder. Whoever made those prints was still close. The back door was locked, but the frame was rotted and the latch plate looked loose. I heard a rhythmic thumping coming from the front of the house, dull, heavy impacts like wet sandbags hitting wood. That noise was my cover. I slid the flat bar into the jamb, gave a gentle twist, and the door popped open with a soft groan that was swallowed by the noise out front. I stepped into the mudroom, rifle up. The air that hit me was wrong. It smelled sweet and sour at the same time, like spoiled meat buried under wood smoke, the smell of infection and bad hygiene. The mudroom was cluttered with coats and boots, some still laced. A winter parka lay on the bench, stiff with dried fluids, a dark smear running down the sleeve. The main room beyond was dim, curtains drawn, but a razor-thin line of yellow light leaked from under an interior door farther back. That light stopped me cold. Power wasn't supposed to be here, and nobody burns batteries for light unless they have a reason. My voice stayed low and flat when I finally spoke. "Hello, I see the light. I'm not looking for trouble." A tense pause followed, then a quiet shuffle from behind that interior door. A man's voice answered, close but controlled, vibrating with stress. "Freeze, keep your voice down, they're right outside the front." As if to prove it, something hit the front door with a heavy thud, then another. The kind of impact that doesn't care about pain or bruising. The mudroom stayed still, but I could hear nails scratching at the outer wood siding. On a shelf by the bench, I saw 2 tactical packs stuffed to bursting with cans and dry goods, and beside them a trauma kit with a red cross patch. Whatever these people were, they were packed to bug out. The realization hit like a physical weight. Someone was alive in here. They were calm enough to communicate, and the threat was literally banging on the front door. This trip just changed from a salvage run to a rescue. The interior door cracked open a few inches, revealing a slice of a woman's face. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and she wore a beanie pulled low. One hand rested on her headlamp, ready to kill the light if I twitched wrong. A man stood behind her, blocking the rest of the view, broad shoulders under a puffy jacket that was too tight across the chest, holding a chef's knife low by his thigh. My voice stayed low and slow, trying to de-escalate the adrenaline in the room. "I'm Wesley," I said, keeping the rifle angled down at the floorboards, stock against my hip. "I came up from the city last night. I'm here for supplies, and I'm leaving the way I came." The woman watched my hands, not my eyes, then nodded once and said, "Elowen," before adding in a harsh whisper, "Keep it quiet. They've been working on that front door for an hour." The man gave a short, tense nod and said, "Hugh," then glanced toward the mudroom window like he expected it to implode. A heavy thump hit the front of the cabin again, the wood groaning under the stress, followed by the wet sound of something scraping the siding. Elowen stayed behind the door jamb as cover and said, "We didn't come here to get rescued. We came because the map showed a remote structure. We thought that meant safe." Hugh exhaled sharply through his nose and said, "Turns out it just means food. Food means people, and people turn." I glanced past them and realized they weren't just raiding the kitchen cupboards. They had hit a jackpot. 2 tactical rucksacks sat stuffed beside the bench, seams straining, bulging with the square shapes of bulk goods. A third duffel bag lay open, revealing heavy canvas sacks, rice and dried beans, likely from a root cellar or a prepper stash under the floor. That was winter weight calorie counts, not just weekend snacks. Elowen followed my eyes and said, "We found a cache under the pantry floorboards. 50 pounds of rice, dried beans, canned meat. We took everything we could lift." Hugh lifted a red medical pouch off the shelf and added, "We've got a trauma kit too. Not much, but it's clean, and there's a full course of broad-spectrum antibiotics in here." The word antibiotics hit me harder than the food. That was currency more valuable than gold. "How many outside?" I asked. Hugh shrugged, shifting his grip on the knife. "Hard to tell. Enough that the hinges won't last if they start pushing in unison." Elowen looked past me toward the darker mudroom and said, "You breached the back door without us hearing it over the noise. That means the back route is still viable." "I've got a winter shelter up trail," I said, keeping the pitch simple. "Metal capsule buried in a bowl, sealed, hidden, and I've been lining it and setting up a wood stove." Elowen's eyes flicked up to mine, assessing the lie. "How far?" she asked. "A few miles," I answered. "It's a haul, but we can make it in daylight." Hugh shifted his weight and said, "We're sure as hell not walking out the front." Another violent hit landed on the main door, wood cracking this time, and the room went deathly still. Elowen waited a beat, then said, "Back door, into the tree line. No running unless the breach is total." A check came next, fast and direct. Elowen looked me dead in the face and said, "Any bites, scratches, or fluid exchange that isn't yours?" "No," I answered, and lifted my sleeves enough for her to see clean skin at the wrists. "You?" Hugh shook his head and said, "Clean." Elowen added, "Same," then tapped the medical pouch and said, "If we move with you, we share supplies and we follow one set of rules." "Deal," I said. "Light discipline, noise discipline, and nobody wanders off alone." Elowen nodded once, accepting the terms. Hugh slid one of the heavy rucksacks toward me and said, "This is heavy. Takes the cans if you can handle the weight." I shouldered the pack and the straps bit instantly into my trapezius. It was brutally heavy, easily 60 pounds, but coupled with my sled up trail, it was manageable. Taking them with me wasn't a charity case, it was a calculation. 2 strangers in a hut full of food are either allies now or a starving threat later. And I'd rather have the food and the extra hands inside the wire. Elowen moved like someone used to navigation, scanning the yard in short sectors, while Hugh checked the straps on the bags with a focus that told me he was holding it together by focusing on the logistics. We moved to the back porch. As I stepped over a pile of debris, my boot slid on a buried board. The rusted head of a nail caught my pant leg and kissed my shin. It stung, a sharp, hot line of pain, but I gritted my teeth and ignored it. It wasn't a dramatic wound, just a scratch, and stopping on an exposed porch while zombies battered down the front door felt suicidal. The back door opened onto a drifted porch and a narrow path into the timber. The wind was our ally, masking the sound of our boots. Elowen took point, moving flat-footed and low. Hugh followed, breathing rhythmically through his nose, knife stowed, hands free for balance. I took the rear guard. The last look back showed the front door bowing inward, splinters flying as the wood finally gave way. The crash of the front door failing echoed through the house, masking our exit perfectly. We didn't run. We marched. 1 set in front, 2 behind, tight spacing. The camp disappeared behind the trees and the mountain swallowed the noise. Up trail, the bowl waited. If we could haul this weight up the incline before the adrenaline crashed, we'd have a door that locked and enough food to stop counting days and start planning months. The return leg was a brutal hump. The weight of the scavenged food plus the sled I was dragging loaded with the heavy grain sacks turned every switchback into a lung-burning ordeal. The wind stayed steady, which helped scrub our noise, and the timber provided visual cover, but every time a branch snapped under a boot, 3 heads snapped around, freezing to listen for a reaction. The bowl finally came into view late in the afternoon. The capsule looked exactly as I'd left it, low, gray, tucked in the defilade behind the rock, the tarp still lashed over the wood stash. No fresh tracks circled the door. Relief arrived physically. My shoulders dropped an inch as the tension released. Elowen stepped close, running her gloved fingertips along the door seam and said, "This is good. It's ugly, it's tight, and it's quiet." Hugh nodded, eyeing the lack of windows on the approach, and added, "One door is a gift. It means only one direction to defend." The latch opened with a muted, satisfying click. No ringing metal this time. Inside, space became the immediate tactical problem. 3 people in a metal tube meant the floor plan had to be militaristic. Packs went against the uphill wall. The cooking kit stayed strictly on the door side near the vent. Boots were lined up, toes pointing out, so nobody tripped during a night alert. We dropped the slit covers while we shifted gear because movement behind a window is what catches the eye from a mile away. The sleeping situation was the biggest logistical hurdle. The floor was a heat sink, too cold to sleep on without massive insulation we didn't have. The benches were narrow. The solution was a rotation system, or what the Navy calls hot racking. I laid it out simply. We run 3 shifts. 1 person is always awake, sitting up on watch. The other 2 sleep on the benches on the foam pads. We rotate every 4 hours. Nobody freezes on the floor and the shelter is never unguarded. Elowen nodded and pointed at the hygiene corner, adding her own SOP. Hands get sanitized before touching food or gear every single time. 1 sick person in a box this size takes us all out. Hugh gave a tired smile, rubbed his face, and said, "And we don't cook anything that smells like a diner. Bland is safe." Job settled fast. Hugh took over food rationing and the stove because the fire needed steady hands more than brave ones. Elowen took lead on watch schedules and navigation, starting a notebook with distances and landmarks like the world still respected cartography. My lane remained the structural integrity, the shell, the door, the vent, and the perimeter security. The hardware we'd scavenged turned into immediate upgrades. I used the hose clamps to tighten the stovepipe joints until they stopped wiggling and clinking in the wind gusts. The fiberglass gasket ropes sealed the drafty edge around the intake vent, and the metal shears allowed me to cut 2 small baffles from scrap tin. I installed them behind the window slits so light couldn't spill straight out. It had to bounce twice, killing the glow. Hugh held the lamp while I worked. Elowen kept watch, and by the time we were done, the capsule was tighter and darker than ever. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. That first night as a trio was colder than it should have been because nobody slept deeply. The tent stove ran for a short burn to dry our sweat, then went cold. Hugh warmed a mug on the canister stove and passed it around. Elowen sat with her back to the wall, eyes on the slit, and said, "If you hear something outside, don't sit up fast. Just listen first. Sound tells you the story before you need to look." Morning revealed that the cut on my shin was more than a scratch. The fabric of my base layer had stuck to the wound, and peeling it back was a sharp, nauseating pain. The line of the cut was angry red, and the skin around it looked tight and shiny. Hugh crouched close, inspecting it with a frown, and said, "That's going to get septic if we ignore it." Elowen popped the medical pouch and added, "We clean it now. Boiled water, iodine, then a sterile wrap." The wound got rinsed, dabbed with iodine until the sting made my vision blur, then covered with a clean pad and tape that wouldn't peel off in sweat. Elowen watched my face closely and said, "If you feel feverish or start getting chills, you tell us immediately. Don't try to tough it out." "Understood," I said, though I felt a knot of worry tighten in my gut. Food looked better now, not infinite, but organized. Hugh unpacked their haul and stacked it by type. Heavy cans low for ballast, dry goods above, snacks in a ready bag, coffee and salt in a separate tin. He surveyed the stack and said, "One warm meal a day. We keep the stove for drying gear and morale, not for pretending this is a ski lodge." Elowen added, "And we keep one day pack loaded. If we have to punch out in 10 seconds, we grab it and go." Traps came up when the reality of winter calorie burn set in. Hugh pointed toward the lower tree line and said, "I saw rabbit tracks on the lower slope. Not a highway, but enough to try." Elowen looked at me for the sign-off and asked, "Worth the exposure?" "Worth trying," I said, "as long as the checks are short and random." So the plan stayed small. A few simple wire snares placed low where tracks already existed, checked only in full light, and never on a predictable schedule. The baling wire from the shed was perfect for it. Hugh handled the sets, and Elowen stood overwatch with the slit cracked a finger's width. Wood became the other routine. Hugh volunteered for the collection runs, which made sense because he had an eye for what would burn clean versus what would smoke. He said, "I'll stick to small dead stuff daily. We build a drying stack inside by the door to get the moisture content down before burning." I agreed and said, "Standard rule. Nobody goes outside the wire alone until we know what else is moving out here." Days blurred into a survival routine. Heat came in short, intense bursts. Water bottles stayed topped off. Slit covers went up only when someone was on active watch. Some evenings, movement showed through the trees, shadows that didn't match the wind. But nobody spoke about it until morning light. My leg didn't stay quiet. A week later, the redness had spread beyond the wrap and the skin felt hot to the touch. A dull, throbbing ache climbed up my calf when I stood. Elowen didn't lecture me. She looked at the angry color, then looked me in the eye and said, "That's a streak starting. Antibiotics start today." Hugh handed over the pills and added, "Eat first, then you stay off that leg. You're on bench duty until that fever breaks." I swallowed the pill with warm water. The wrap got changed again. For the first time, relying on them didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the only reason I was still in the game. That night, the wind pressed hard on the capsule, and the trees creaked like old hinges. Elowen took the first watch, sitting low by the slit, and whispered, "If people come up here, it'll be for smoke or food. We keep both invisible." Hugh lay back on the bench, eyes open in the dark, and added, "And if they still find us, we decide fast." Sleep came in thin, broken pieces. Winter hadn't even started its worst work yet, and now 3 lives depended on one latch. The antibiotics didn't work magic overnight, but after 48 hours, the sepsis lines stopped climbing my leg and the fever finally broke. Elowen inspected the dressing every morning, her face tight with focus. If that redness moves another inch, you wake me up immediately. A bad infection in these temps isn't just an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. Hugh kept the rations steady and bland, handing me a mug with a strict order. Hydrate, then sleep. You're useless to the team until you're weight-bearing again. While I wrote out the healing process, the capsule operated on strict lockdown protocols. Wood harvesting was restricted to high noon light and only standing dead. Timber dry enough to snap clean. Wet wood smokes and a smoke column in a clear sky is basically a flare gun for anyone watching. We ran the stove in short, hot bursts with the vent cracked to scrub the exhaust, and the blackout curtains stayed taped down unless a sentry was actively scanning. The first contact wasn't a face, it was a signature. Boot prints crossed near our snare line, looped toward the defilade, then backed out. Hugh crouched by the tread marks and muttered, "That's a recon loop. Someone sniffing for a heat source." Elowen nodded grimly. "If the camp down trail is compromised, this ridge is the next logical step." That night we went cold camp, no fire, and ate cold rations in the dark. Around midnight, a sound cut through the wind noise, 2 crunching steps, a hesitation, and the metallic tink of a zipper pull brushing the outer shell. Elowen, who was on watch, squeezed my shoulder hard and whispered, "Freeze. Listen." Hugh's hand was already on the rifle bolt. A voice came through the seam, low and cracking with exhaustion. "Hey, I see the stovepipe in the tarp. I'm solo. I'm not looking for a firefight." Silence hung heavy for 3 seconds. Then Elowen spoke through the steel, her voice flat as a dial tone. "Back up into the timber, hands visible. Do it now." The man answered, "Okay, okay." And the crunch of boots retreated until his silhouette appeared in the slit, hands high, pack dropped in the snow. He looked wrecked, cheeks frostbitten, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Elowen didn't waver. "State your business." The man swallowed hard and said, "Calories." "Just enough to keep walking." Elowen replied, "We don't board strangers. If you've been bitten or scratched, step away from this door." He shook his head violently. "No bites, just hypothermic." I spoke up from the bench. "Leave the pack. Step back another 5 yards." He complied slowly, knowing how fast fear turns into a trigger pull. Elowen said, "1 bottle of water, 1 ration bar. Then you move downhill and you forget this place exists." Relief washed over him. "Thank you," he breathed, keeping his hands up. Suddenly, the hand-crank radio on the shelf crackled to life with a signal clearer than we'd heard in weeks. A smooth, confident voice cut through the static, too polished for the apocalypse. "This is North Corridor Relief. We have a secure perimeter at Highway Marker 42. Power, medical, and hot food available. Proceed to marker for extraction." Hugh glanced at Elowen and whispered, "That sounds like a recording." Elowen frowned and murmured, "It sounds like a honeypot." The man outside heard it and his head snapped up. "Extraction?" Elowen didn't answer. She slid the food through a cracked opening and snapped the bungee back. The man grabbed the supplies but stared at the capsule wall like he could see the radio. "If that's real," he yelled, "you're crazy to stay up here." Hugh whispered, "If it's a trap, it catches the desperate." The man backed into the trees, eyes still wide with hope, until he vanished. At first light, we sanitized the site. We swept our tracks, brushed snow over the woodpile, and relocated the snare line to break up the pattern. Nothing fancy, just erasing the signature. After he was gone, Elowen killed the radio volume and said, "Radio silence from now on unless we initiate." Hugh nodded. "And no smoke unless someone is literally freezing to death." The capsule went dark and winter kept grinding forward. Winter didn't announce itself with a calendar date. It arrived with the first week where the sun failed to breach the ridgeline and the wind stayed razor-sharp even at high noon. Snow stacked in relentless layers, powder at first, then packed into concrete hardpack by the gales. The trail that had been a clear navigational line became a ghost memory you had to feel out with your boots. The capsule kept doing its job, but the margin for error got razor thin. Wood dried slower in the freezing air. Gloves stayed damp unless the stove ran hot, and running the stove hot was a tactical risk because a warm pipe creates a heat shimmer and a faint plume, and tired eyes are always scanning the horizon for plumes. Hugh adjusted the protocol by cutting the burn time shorter and feeding the stove with premium bone-dry splits we'd processed inside. He'd get the cast iron body glowing, then shut the damper down and let the thermal mass radiate heat after the flame died. Elowen monitored every burn, sitting cross-legged by the wall with one slit cracked, whispering, "If anything moves on that slope, the fire gets smothered instantly." Food transitioned from a survival panic into a monotonous routine you could feel in your gut. The massive haul of rice and beans we'd dragged up on the sled was keeping us alive, but flavor fatigue is a real thing. The easy snacks and canned meats disappeared early, leaving us with bland bowls of starch stretched with melted snow, followed by hot water that did more for morale than core temperature. One snare finally paid off with a scrawny snowshoe hare. Hugh processed it outside on the downwind side with surgical speed, brought the meat in wrapped tight, and said, "This buys us a day of protein, not a season. Don't get used to it." Nobody argued. The cold hit hardest during the graveyard hours. Sleep continued in the hot-racking shifts we'd established, not because it sounded heroic, but because waking up late with a frozen stove is how people die. Elowen took the first watch, Hugh took the middle, and my slot was the pre-dawn stretch, when the air inside felt brittle and the metal walls groaned as the shell contracted in the deep freeze. The observation slits stayed taped shut unless there was a sound, and even then, the check was a half-second peak before going dark again. A major storm system pinned us down for 48 hours straight. Wind drove the snow sideways, filling the bowl until the downhill drift crept up toward the door handle, and the capsule shuddered when gusts hammered the curved roof. Venting became a life safety issue because the external stack wanted to ice over. Hugh tapped the pipe during a lull and said, "If this plugs while we're burning, we wake up dead from carbon monoxide." Elowen answered without looking up from her notebook. "Then we don't run it. We bundle up and wait." We switched to the canister stove for water, running it in short bursts while everyone stayed wrapped in foil blankets, preserving body heat. When the storm finally broke, the world outside looked erased. All tracks were gone. Tree limbs sagged under the load. The woodpile had a thick ice crust, and the dry core was getting smaller than the math allowed. Hugh stared at the stack and said, "We need to process more fuel before the next front hits." Elowen scanned the valley and added, "And we need a protocol for contact." Someone heard that radio message and someone is going to follow it up here. No strangers showed up at the door, but their ghosts did. Fresh boot prints crossed the lower slope, not approaching us but cutting a traverse close enough to put us on a route. A torn strip of bright orange fabric hung from a branch near the creek crossing, blazing a trail against the white snow. It might have been harmless. It might have been a breadcrumb for a larger group. That night we held a council of war. Elowen opened the debate. If we stay completely invisible, we survive the elements, but we might miss our only window for extraction. Hugh countered, "If we chase every smooth voice on the radio, we walk into a processing center and crowds are just petri dishes now." My legs still ached on the coldest days, a reminder of how fragile safety is, so I cast the deciding vote. "We don't go looking," I said. "We listen on our terms, and we set a passive signal that doesn't compromise our position." The plan was a dead drop signal. No fires, no flares unless it was a medical emergency. Instead, we improvised a VS-17 panel using a high-contrast tarp. Hugh cut it into a geometric square and reinforced the grommets so the wind wouldn't shred it. Elowen marked it with a black charcoal V symbol. Not a message you have to read, just a shape that screams occupied to aerial or ridgeline observers. We added a signal mirror to the kit. On clear days, a focused flash travels farther than smoke and leaves no lingering trail. Elowen practiced angles, bouncing light toward a distant rock face, then the tree line, saying, If anyone is scanning with optics, this gives them a chance to see us without us shouting." Hugh nodded and said, "It's a handshake, not a billboard." The radio stayed off to save batteries, but we gave it a strict window. 10 minutes at dusk, volume low, ear to the speaker. One evening, the smooth Highway 42 voice returned, repeating the same pitch on a loop. Hugh shook his head. "Too clean. That's a lure." Elowen listened longer and said, "It's selling hope to desperate people." Then a different signal cut in, weak, rough, and human. "Attention, high sites above the canyon," the voice rasped. "If you have shelter, hold fast. Do not move at night. Spring extraction is being coordinated for high-altitude pockets. We can't promise timing, but we are building a list. Stay put." The message broke, sizzled, and died. Silence filled the capsule. Hugh finally exhaled and said, "That one." That sounded real. Elowen nodded. "A list means someone is still counting souls." The urge to transmit back was overwhelming, but transmitting meant broadcasting a signal others could triangulate. A compromise formed. We wouldn't transmit. We would leave a physical dead drop. The cloth panel went up on the rock during daylight hours. A small waterproof stash box went under a flat stone near a distinctive boulder containing a note, 3 survivors. Winter shelter secure, fuel limited, infection status negative, holding for spring. Patience became the hardest survival skill. Every instinct screamed for action, a march to a road, a run toward a rumor. But winter taught a brutal lesson. Control isn't about moving, it's about staying put when movement kills you. By the time the next low-pressure system rolled in, the capsule had rules, roles, and a strategy. Spring was still just a word, not a date, but for the first time it felt like a destination we might actually reach. By late winter, the bowl felt smaller, but it also felt dialed in. Every thermal groan of the shell had a diagnosis, every draft had a fix. The stove ran clean and the water bottles stood in formation like soldiers. Hunger stopped being a panic and turned into a simple caloric equation that Hugh managed with calm hands. Elowen kept the logbook filled with data, not poetry, wind vectors, drying times, patrol loops. She said once, "If we make it to spring, it won't be because we got lucky. It'll be because we stayed boring." That line stuck. Boring is safe. My leg healed into a stiff scar, a permanent reminder that in the cold, small injuries grow teeth. The antibiotics didn't make us invincible. They just bought us the time to make better decisions. We kept the capsule blacked out most nights. When we burned wood, we did it early, letting the pipe cool before twilight to kill the thermal plume. The signal panel stayed folded unless the sky was hard blue, and even then it went up for short windows before disappearing back into the rock. The radio stayed quiet, but that rough, tired voice returned twice in February with the same directive. Hold high sights. Avoid crowds. Plan for spring movement. No rescue fantasies, just a reminder that someone out there was still trying to organize the chaos. When the sun finally started climbing higher and the snow softened into slush at midday, the plan wasn't a speech. It was muscle memory. 3 bug-out bags sat ready by the door. A dead drop note was sealed under the rock. The signal panel sat rolled with paracord already threaded. This capsule was never meant to be a home. It was designed to keep a stranded hiker alive for one night. We turned it into a bunker with tape, plastic, and discipline. And with 2 people I didn't expect to meet when I fled the city. If you're listening to this, the first winter didn't break us. It taught us the only things that matter. Heat you can control, water you can trust, and the discipline to stay quiet when the world gets loud. Spring is coming, and when it does, we'll be ready to move. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.